Hello, and welcome to Business Brew, the podcast brought to you by BUSINESSiQ here at the Northern Echo. Very pleased to say that our guest today is Dom Lusardi, a mentor and advisor specializing in tech and AI, someone we always go to for an update on how we're doing with these sort of things. How are you doing, Dom?
I'm great, thanks, Mike. I'm great. Enjoying the sun that we finally got, and doing well, keeping busy. It's an interesting time both in the startup space and tech industry for us at the moment.
Yeah, let's talk about that because, as you know, one of my sort of common threads is all about the skills and training whether the region needs to have in place to take full advantage of whatever is there in front of it. You're doing a bit of work in the startup space yourself at the moment, is that right?
Yes, yeah. I'm lucky. I get to work with Durham University in the entrepreneur residence in their venture school, and I also support Edge Innovation in their recent funding that they've been doing as part of the Combined Authorities push to get companies to innovate in the local area and creating challenges around that as well. So it's that on top of a few bits of NED work that I do. I kind of keep very active in that kind of startup and growth space of the tech industry.
Yeah, just sort of paint a picture of how it is in sort of that education and skills side of things. Are we completely aware and taking full advantage of is everyone completely geared up? Is there still a bit of a knowledge gap yet? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think it's one of those typical things with the tech industry of that the technology itself outpaces education. So by the time that education is able to catch up with where we currently are with the technology and how it's being applied, where we were 2 years ago, say with AI, what you would have been teaching 2 years ago compared to what you'd be teaching now is quite different because it's advanced very quickly. And it's taken away some of the bottlenecks that there, but it's also created an opportunity for people to be doing their own AI, really, as a position where we're very reliant on kind of the supercomputing, the models that are available to us and using the online methodologies, whereas recently you've seen advances of people being able to hold their own models and train their own models on local computers as well. And so it's starting to, as often happens with most technology and in new industries, it starts to branch, and starting to see that branching is meaning that education is challenged to try and keep up with what the opportunity is and where do they keep their focus.
Yeah, no, I'd imagine that's the case. As I said to a few businesses I've talked to recently, that their skills, you have to be so agile because stuff is going to be happening in AI, goodness me, in like 1 week and 2 weeks time, somebody's going to come up with something that we haven't quite seen before or some adaptation of it. You've got to, I mean, even people like you, Dom, as I say, we see as this sort of an AI guru, but even you must be reading up on it all the time just to try and keep pace with what's happening.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it really is interesting because it's branching in such a way that I think people will, and I always see AI as a tool. But I think people are starting to take that approach of rather than looking at it as a service that they buy in, how do they actually make it part of their organization? How do they actually make a significant difference? Because there's ethical considerations on top of, as well as the productivity that it brings around. Sure. And I think because of that puts us in a really interesting space as to, when you focus on AI at the moment, are we talking about where it can be making significant impacts on industry, but also ensuring that we are doing it in an ethical way that isn't impacting potential employment opportunities as well, and where the benefit is both of them, because invest too early, you could end up being caught on the sharp end, invest too late, then you're playing catch up. And I think with AI, it's developing at such a pace that it's quite interesting that I think it's more in the space of you need to be developing your methodology and mindset of how you want to apply it to your business, rather than what's the tools that I could be using to just improve my business.
Yeah. Do you think something like AI, can it move too fast? Would we rather it sort of just slowed so we can sort of get a grip of it, have a really good think about it? Because at the moment, as you suggest, it's almost going to outpace us and our thinking about how to deal with it.
Yeah, I know you put it perfectly there, Mike. If you were to go back to kind of the idea of social media, we're all very much accepting of the principles what social media could bring, the benefits that it could bring. we find ourselves many years later in a position of going, but there's actually quite a lot of unintended consequences along the way. And I think it's when you adopt a new technology, it's the period of time that you have it lets you to understand what the unintended consequences were, which might not necessarily be understood in the first instance. They're done with the best intentions, but further down the line, does that actually change people's approach or people's mindsets around what employment looks like, what productivity looks like within an organization? And I think it's where I've always liked to see AI is, how can it be a kind of co-pilot? How can it help advance the individual so that they can be more productive, that they can be more accurate in the work that they're doing, and less repetitive? And I think that's where it's definitely got its advantages, but it's trying to understand that when you're taking those advantages on, that you're not just making life easy for yourself, rather than actually making more profit or more opportunities for the organization.
Yeah, I'm still at the stage where I'm, even at my ripe age, I'm still sort of excited by the possibilities, but I'm never quite sure whether a lot of that is to do with my naivety about the larger implications of it. Because individually, and obviously as a media business, we've just only very recently taken on our first AI-assisted reporter here, who's doing stories across all sorts of sectors, but always with using AI as an information feed or in whatever way. I myself, I'm part of one of NewsQuest's early adopters initiative, which is basically a sort of an organic sort of a think tank, in that we're all working in very different sectors. I'm obviously more sort of long form writing. And so that's a very different thing to some of the more sort of online heavy stuff that we're doing now. But we're always thinking it's a general, what can we do today? What's somebody come up with, and sharing these sort of ideas. I find that exciting. Yes. Now, I don't know, as I say, whether that's the fact that, I'm not a sort of a 25-year-old who's starting in the business and thinking, what's my next 25 years going to be like? I mean, goodness knows, we just can't possibly predict that, can we?
No, and I think where we are now as in the industry, in the region as well, is it's great to hear that you're taking that approach around that kind of think tank approach, because like I say, it's the unintended consequences. I'm an innovator. I've always liked to be in that space. I always encourage people to play. I think playing is the most important thing that you can possibly do. So by doing so in that way of playing, you understand how it can be applied to business, and you can start to understand what the unintended consequences might be without necessarily adopting it fully commercially in the first instance. Where I work in the startup space at Durham, it's really interesting to see a lot of the startup ideas are very purpose-led. And it's really reassuring to see that, in the sense of they're tackling problems that have been barriers to them during their education or their own development, that are opportunities that should be aggregated to many, but they found, unless you've got the opportunity to either have the finances or the connections in place, they weren't available to you. And I find AI is a really good place in that sense, and it's really refreshing to see the startups reflecting on the potential impact that they could have, but also how can they level the playing field rather than give people unfair advantages as well, which is really reassuring. And that's one thing that I could say I've really reflected on in the startup industry. People are very much more purpose-driven in what it is that they're trying to do, not necessarily based on commercial outputs, but the potential impact that they could have in society and how they could improve knowledge sharing as well.
Yeah. Forgive me for repeating a question I'm sure I've put to you a dozen times already in the past, but there's still a concern, of course, that we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here, and that we're creating and building something which has clearly got the potential to take away jobs.
Yes.
And potentially, I'm a journalist, so I don't think AI is a threat to me creatively, because I write certain ways and I put my own thoughts and feelings. I don't think, I'm still going to be proved wrong, I'm sure, but I don't think it's a threat to me in that way. But I can see how the simpler stories that some people do can be taken away by that. So we have that sort of really difficult balance, don't we, where we want to embrace it, understand it, but also we're thinking, I think this might be doing my, and that's across any sector, I think this might be doing my job in a few years.
Yeah, precisely. And I think in that sense is, it actually comes down to the technology, which is the really interesting part here is, by running to AI too quickly, we might all end up being the same thing. Because inherently in the way we do it, if we think about, not getting too technical in it, the world of AI, it's very much based on the data in which it's trained. And the data that we using to then produce results from that AI and do queries from that, if we're doing them to talk about, say media and talk about impressions about what's happening, say, with the local politics, all you're going to find is that everybody's saying the same thing because it's trained on the same information. And that's where you start to get what I'm beginning to see is now the new arms race in AI is who can have the model that people use the most. So you've got OpenAI, obviously ChatGPT is their model that they're using. You then have Facebook, the Llama model that they have, which is an incredibly flexible model and outpaces quite a lot of the other ones. You have Google's, you have Twitter's, you're starting to see these models come online. And so what you're beginning to see is now a different arms race as to who can own the model that people are using the most. It's kind of like VHS, Betamax all of a sudden again. They're kind of going, well, which one produces the best results? Because they'll all produce them based on what is necessarily the underlying data that they've been trained on. Obviously, Facebook is going to be trained on Facebook's data. Microsoft is going to be trained on 365 data. OpenAI is going to be trained on open data that's freely available. And when we take that information that the AI is giving us, do we know actually the source in which it's been led from? And I think that is now a new space that people are starting to question a little bit more, and rightly so, because what seems like natural language that we're getting back is actually a series of statistics that are prompting the probability of what the right thing is to say. But that's based on the underlying data that it's pulling that from. So, I kind of, it's really nice space to be in, like yourself, of going, I feel true creatives have got the greatest opportunity in AI. And the reason why I say that is because it will constantly need training. It will need refreshing. It will need new thought in there because it's only a compilation of everything that's happened, not everything that's going to happen. And so being in the creative space, that we both operate in, I find is actually a really, really interesting time because this is an opportunity to start to train the models to be more responsive around what is relevant rather than what is easy to sell.
Really interesting thought, that, because I've found myself doing that already. We've got Microsoft here, so I have Copilot, which obviously doesn't force itself on me, but it's always there. And of course, we've got ChatGPT. And I do find myself doing that. I'll put a query into each one and see which one I fancy. But I'm never at the point, and I don't know at what stage we get to the point of 100% trusting it. Because whatever we put in, obviously from a media point of view, if it says, I don't know, do a profile of Dom Lusardi for me, and it will write a certain thing, but I will still feel obliged to check that just to make sure it hasn't pulled from somewhere the wrong piece of advice. Now, I don't know, do we ever get to the stage where we can completely trust it and we know it's writing the right thing?
This is my own personal feeling, but I don't think we should. I really don't think we should. I think it's the combination of the two that makes us unique in the way in which we do it. How do we take that information and make it relevant to the people that we're doing? Otherwise, we just get into a world of automation, and that automation just means that we'll all be saying the same thing. And so that unique element, I think, is really critical. But I also kind of see this as what I refer to as the arms race of people can now download their own models. They can train their own language models. And so that means, let's say, for instance, I was working with yourselves in here and went, right, I'm going to put in everything you guys have ever written. So it's going to always be around you, and it's your style in the way in which you do it. But what it's not going to do is that it's not going to look at the Times, and it's not going to look at the Sun. It's not going to look at any of those ones. So it's not influenced by other sources. I can guarantee that this is a direct source for you. Now, that's obviously more applicable to you, but all of a sudden starts creating this, what I'm referring to as the fragmentation that we're starting to see in the AI industry of going, well, you're using the available models that everybody else is using. You're training your own model. You're trying to create your own data set from here. It's an interesting space. And again, just as exciting, but we're now into that kind of next level up of what's happening with AI, of kind of going, okay, it works. Now let's understand, now it works. How can I make sure it works better? And I think that's really where we're at the moment. And to hear yourselves doing that, having that think tank, I can only applaud you in doing so. This is what I worry about is people either avoid it because it's too overwhelming, or they buy so deep into it, then they can't, changes may happen in the future and they can't get out of it. And I think right now is the time to be asking these pertinent questions.
Yeah, I think you've got to be honest, and people, as you say, who maybe put their head in the sand and think, I'm not going to help educate that because it might take my job. I do think the opposite thing. I think you have to embrace it, and you have, like any sort of new technology, let's at least have a really deep look at it. Let's see what it can do, and if we don't want it at some stage, then we opt out. But you've got to learn everything about it first to really sort of understand it.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect case in point is the mentoring that I do. I will often turn up and try to give an example of an organization. What I've been able to do using AI, I'm able to create a fictitious company, a fictitious business plan, and a fictitious opportunities for them to develop around, which gives me a business model canvas. Now, from my point of view, that's great because while I'm only there maybe for an hour, 2 hours, or a half day, is my time best spent creating that information so I can talk about it on the day, or is it easier for me to be able to extract something that's generated that encompasses around a conversation that we want to have? It's not the actual data that's in there that's key, it's the ability to what additionality does that bring to the conversation by reducing some of the legwork that is generally put into trying to create a conversation.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I'm presuming that much like when any sort of new technology, simple things like mobile phones and all that young people more instinctively go for it because it's new to them, and because they're in a curious age, they embrace it more than that sort of older generation. So I'm sort of hoping that means that we're already starting to build a very AI aware generation of people who are going to exist alongside it completely naturally and organically. Is that possible? Is that a plus?
It's my hope more than anything. I'll be honest with you. What I can see on a educational level, grassroots level, if we're talking primary and secondary, there is such a fear around AI that people are using it to cheat and to get there.
Sure.
That it's seen as a problem rather than as an opportunity. And so while people are learning to use this technology and learning the impact of it, I feel that we are at a grassroots educational level actually showing what advantages this could have and where ethics come into play with it. And, if we're not careful, we're going to be capturing that conversation at a higher education level where people's principles have actually been built up. And so it's one thing I'm encouraging schools and education to really look at is to develop a strategy. It might not be perfect, it might not be right, but some form of strategy that you can adhere to and that people understand the rules of the game is more important than just avoiding it altogether and seeing it as a threat. Where there's threats, there's opportunities. What they are in education, I think it can really assist learning in different ways. It's a really good research tool. But I think it's seen as a way of taking away the work from people in education. I liken that to why not bringing a calculator into your maths exam. I understand why you didn't, because you need to work we're doing, but calculators are never going away. And I see AI in the exact same space. It's not going away. So how do we learn to understand it and encompass it in our actual education, rather than turn a blind eye to it and wait for it to catch us out?
Yeah, that the thing about sort of faking the exams and that sort of thing is really interesting, because maybe this is too simplistic, but surely you use AI against itself in a way, in that you say, spot where this essay or these answers are being assisted by AI. If someone is using that for research or for or writing large chunks of a thesis, for instance, then one would presume that AI is smart enough from a teacher's point of view to sort of run it through that and say, yeah, this bit's hasn't been originated from that student.
Yes, well, and the difficult thing, and the fairness to the students and the teachers in that one, is going back to what we were saying previously. If a student has used AI and the teachers want to check that, if they're not checking it against the model that the student used, then it's not going to know. So let's say if I used GPT to do my exams, but they were using the Llama model to check whether I'd been using it or not, the two different data sources, so they're not actually going to know each other. So it's a real challenge in education at this moment in time. And I think it's one of those ones that, I feel more support could be put in place for people that are in education right now. But we are, unfortunately, in a little bit of the Wild West. It's a bit like when the web first came online. Going, what is this thing and how do we use it? And it instantly challenges areas like education. But you look at where the internet first came into education, everybody's kind of like, oh, I'm not sure about this. Whereas now it's actually the fundamental backbone of education. So I believe it will eventually find its place, but it's changing at such a rapid pace that I think it isolates people from being able to act in it. But having the conversation, opening up the conversation, and opening up to challenge, I think is where we need to be.
And also, I presume that sort of Wild West side of it means it's almost impossible to put in place regulations and laws about it, because I don't know how you would do that even. And that's a sort of a massive task ahead to say you can't do this and find a way of physically stopping people from doing certain things. It's still a real experiment at the moment, isn't it?
Well, I heard a really interesting thing coming out of Silicon Valley around the regulation of AI, and saying that I don't agree or disagree with this, but it was a very valid statement, saying that any government now that is in the position of putting policy and controls in place could be subject to the rest of the world not following those same rules and being trapped and not being able to take advantage of it. So it's at which point do we switch? At which point is it right to bring in regulation? And which point does regulation actually stop innovation and stop the correct adoption of it as well? It's a really interesting space. It becomes very geopolitical at that point of going, well, yeah, of course there should be regulation, but as we know, the world, not everybody follows the same rules.
What's your view generally, Dom, of how the Northeast sort of Teesside in this area is with AI? Is there a perception that we're in any way sort of leading the way? Or are we keeping pace? Are we just trundling along? I'm interested in your sort of broader view. Do people think this is a place where AI business can be done?
Yeah, I think it's, again, going back to the fragmentation, what you're beginning to see is, rather than having just purpose-led AI organizations, it's, in the gaming industry, how can they help use AI to help them in production? So can they generate their own tools in AI that reduces production time or reduces errors in production? If you were to look at it from a different point of view, say Sage, what they're doing with the AI, can they use it in such a way to make predictions? So I think what you're starting to find with AI is no longer it's just kind of AI in itself. It's kind of like, how do you apply AI in this sector? How do you apply AI in this sector? Legals, professional services, education, technology, and it's got its own benefits in different areas. One of the things that I've seen, I've been working with recently, is individuals that are using AI to create conversations in game with what you call NPCs, non-player characters. And over the years, when you've ever played computer games and you go speak to the kind of computer designed character, they only say a few words and they kind of give you a few prompts. Whereas actually plugging in an AI bot into a character means you could actually have a full-blown conversation with people in that space. So it's like I say, it's no longer this kind of tool that, well, you can query it, I'll give you information. It's actually, how can I use it to create a better experience for the people that are using my existing products? So it's really fascinating to see how it's going to develop in that space.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling stuff. Just one sort of final thought, Dom. Just not long before we started speaking, the government announced that it's axed what was going to be, I think, about 1.5 billion or something investment that the previous government had announced in AI and new technology, and it was going to involve an 800 million pound supercomputer and lots of things like that. Now, because of their financial situation, the new government has said, no, we've got to pull out of that. I just wonder again what your general view is of the government's the commitment to really pushing forward in AI, of the government, the rule makers standing back and saying, let's see how it all develops? Or do you get a feeling there's a real sort of earnestness to support AI in this country?
The few experiences I have, I was lucky to meet with Peter Kyle, the new digital secretary at the part of the Labour government. And I've got to admit, I was very impressed with their approach. They know it's a tool, they know it's got many advantages, they know it can increase productivity, but they're also aware of the unintended consequences. And so what I'm refreshed by is, if you'd have said, we're going to do $1.5 billion investment into AI, when we first started having these conversations a year and a half or so ago, would the same investment be worth anywhere near as much if you made that today? Probably not. And so I suppose I'm reassured that they're hopefully taking the opportunity to look at going, actually, there's never going to be the right moment, but are we doing it because we're doing it out of fear to play catch up? Or are we doing it because we know that it's got advantages to the UK PLC as such, by doing so, that it's going to create opportunities rather than necessarily create new problems. So I'm reassured by it, but I do feel that we need to have a more comprehensive approach as to what our current thoughts are, because it doesn't feel like there's a underlying strategy of where we're going. It kind of feels like we'll deal with what we're given at this moment in time rather than necessarily trying to lead the way.
It's just a fascinating area. As I say, even someone like me gets sort of energized by the potential, the possibilities, and I'm only just starting, literally weeks of sort of looking at this sort of thing. But it intrigues me greatly, and being able to talk to someone like you, Don, about its potential and what needs to be done, what we should put in place, is literally an education.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. I think it's one thing, as you know, I love to talk tech. I'm really excited about the opportunities. If you were to think about, let's say, an MRI scan or a video or a scan or something along those lines, there's so many frames, so many images that it's hard to pick up potential variances in there, things that might be actual issues. That's where AI has got huge opportunity and should be really, really encouraged to be applied in that sector, is where a human just couldn't function in that space. That is where the opportunity for AI really exists. And so I'm really keen to ensure that it's not seen as a threat, because there are absolute opportunities. To go through 1 million research papers and tell you which one is the relevant one is a lot of work. For AI to go through 1 million research papers and tell you what's relevant, it makes absolute sense. It gets us going and it gets the information shared in a much quicker way. And that I can see is the great advantage of the technology.
Right. I think we're all looking forward to being in control, feeling in control of it, and working alongside it. I think that's something I feel quite comfortable about.
Yeah, and I think it's right for you to be doing exactly what you're doing. We need to be raising the questions and going, where is this going with us? What do we see as the opportunities for it going forward? Where is it being applied? And where are the challenges existing, and making sure that we have a voice to keep that pressure on, to ensure that we are, as UK PLC, on track with where the technology is being led. Yeah.
Listen, excellent as ever to talk to you, Dom. I do appreciate you giving the time today. Thank you very much for that. This is, of course, BUSINESSiQ, and this is the Business Brew podcast. We're on YouTube and we're on Spotify. We'll hopefully catch up with you again soon. Thanks very much, Dom. All the best.
Very welcome. Thanks, Mike.